In the next three chapters, we're going to be going into the primary purpose of macroeconomics. So, what's the pragmatic purpose of macroeconomics? Is it useful for marketing? No, not really for marketing, because once you get past the micro level of decision making, individual actors have little, if any, impact on the whole macro economy. Is it useful for businesses to help them make decisions about what products or services to make? No, not really. Once you get past that short term, all production possibilities are possible. And so, yeah, you can use macro data to help you decide whether or not to enter a market, but transactions and niches are determined on the micro level, not on the macro level. Is it designed to make people feel depressed and hopeless, that there's nothing they can do short of a revolution to make their lives better? Well, that may end up being an unintended consequence. It is useful for getting people fired up about the need for change, but no, that's not really practical, is it? So, what is it really good for with us normal, everyday people? In truth, the primary purpose of macroeconomic data is used to make really wealthy people, your top 1%, even wealthier, usually at the expense of the other 99%. This is done through a combination of rent-seeking behavior, where investors seek out the most favorable interest rates, and by choosing the right combination of their portfolio to provide them with the maximum wealth generation. If you don't have access to vast sums of wealth, your ability to take full advantage of macroeconomic conditions is extremely limited. What I believe macroeconomics should be used for is to help policymakers and the general public allocate societal resources in order to create both allocative and productive efficiency. Unfortunately, that hasn't been done in a very long time. As a quick reminder, allocative efficiency is when consumers feel as though they are getting everything they need at a price that they can afford, and productive efficiency is when businesses are producing just enough goods and products for the public to consume at a reasonable profit and at a minimum of waste. It's a great idea, but one that human civilization has yet to see. In Chapter 17, we discuss the different investment instruments that use macroeconomic principles to generate wealth for those who invest in them. First of all, a financial investment should not be confused with an economic investment. An economic investment is one that tends to be long-term in nature and is usually replaced when the useful life of the asset that has been purchased has expired. A financial investment is one where the investor purchases the investment for the sole expectation of obtaining financial gain. To put it more simply, an economic investment builds wealth, while a financial investment makes money. That is a big difference between those two. The text will have you believe that the market is dominated by what we would call in the investment world as plain vanilla securities. These are your stocks, your bonds, and sovereign debt instruments. Yes, these types of investments are still bought and sold in high volumes, but what the text fails to mention in any detail is the derivatives market, which continues to be the fastest growing market and the market that contains the greatest systemic risk for the overall economy. To determine whether or not an investment will derive a financial gain or loss, one must first determine the value of the investment if it did nothing at all. Each year, the value of the dollar goes down as more dollars keep getting added to the money supply. Therefore, in order to determine whether or not an investment has a time value that is greater than the rate of depreciation of the currency, accounting professionals use the present value approach. The problem with the present value approach is that it tends to follow the Taylor rule of monetary growth, which fails to take into account shocks to the economy. Further, if we believe that how GDP is derived is unreliable and exists for the sole benefit of the Fed and the big banks, then all the present value calculation boils down to is an educated guess based on false assumptions. Now let's take a look about how people with a lot more money than I do use what we've been learning to make scads of wealth that they could not possibly spend in their entire lifetimes. The one thing you have to remember when it comes to investing, that in order to make lots of money in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds or derivatives, you have to have lots of money. We're not just talking about millions of dollars here. We're talking about hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars. With money like that, you can put together an investment portfolio that's guaranteed to generate wealth no matter what the rest of the economy happens to be doing. What? You don't have millions of dollars to invest? Then I suppose you're not going to be allowed to play in the biggest rigged casino in the world, where the house, i.e., the economy, always loses. Stocks. Contrary to popular belief, the market value of publicly traded stock has little or nothing to do with how well the company is doing. In the past, buying stock involved detailed research and trend analysis to determine whether investing in this company was a safe investment or not. That's not necessarily true in today's economy. Today, headlines in the news and speeches made by high ranking government officials have a greater impact on stock prices than anything else. In addition, the Fed's program of giving away trillions of dollars to the largest banks had a huge inflationary effect on stock prices. That's because the companies that received the most money from the bailouts were companies on the Dow Jones list of companies. Those companies saw huge expansions on their balance sheets, and this had the effect of artificially inflating profit margins, which made them great choices for investors. On top of that, since banks aren't lending to people and small businesses as much as they should be, many have decided to pull all that money into investments, all perfectly legal. So they buy stock, which increases the market value for everyone. Everybody wins, right? Well, the wealthy investors win. You and me, not so much. Bonds. Bonds are essentially loans to companies and governments. They pay interest over the lifetime of the loan, and when the loan matures, whoever issued the bond pays you the principal in a lump sum payment. But unlike a traditional loan, bonds can be purchased and sold on the bond market, sometimes for many times above its face value. The bond market has been experiencing the same market value inflation as the stock market over the past 10 years. In fact, since 2009, bond prices have risen over 400% for certain bond types. And with the Fed buying over 90% of new Treasury bonds as they're being issued, market values have been inflated even further. Mutual funds. Mutual funds are essentially pre-packaged investment portfolios. You can get funds that are generalized, but most are specialized. Specializations include bonds, stocks, Eurobonds, Asian bonds, or whatever combination of investment vehicles that you can dream of. When you select a fund to invest your retirement benefits into with your 401k election, you are essentially purchasing shares in a mutual fund. The bottom line is that instead of investing their hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital, starting or expanding small businesses, or paying taxes, essentially creating jobs for you and me, investors are looking for the fastest return on their money, where all they have to do is give their fortunes to big investment banks who make billions in profits by putting the money in places where it'll do the least amount of good for society, but generate the greatest profit for them. Now, the investment market has another sinister cousin, the derivatives market. It's not really fair to call a derivative an investment because the investor isn't really investing in anything. It's more like placing a bet in a casino floor, hoping that the bet turns out to be a good one. Some derivatives are used for hedging, which is essentially meaning that you're reducing the risk of a particular investment or group of investments while others are simply used like gambling. In investment circles, we call that a naked derivative. Here is a brief description of the most popular derivatives on the market today. Shorts. These are essentially anti-stocks. You purchase these when you believe a stock is going to go down instead of up. When the stock price goes down, you win. If the stock price goes up, you lose. When shorts are in high demand, central banks usually interpret this as a sign that the economy is about to experience a negative shock. This can also become a self-fulfilling prophecy if too many investors are shorting the market. So some governments have gone so far as to ban the practice of shorting. Unfortunately, when a government does that, the market then interprets that to be a preemptive anticipation of an impending negative shock, and so the market probably tanks anyway. This generates millions in gains for those investors who were lucky enough to buy the shorts before the ban was put into place. Swaps. These are essentially shorts for bonds. Unlike stock shorts, these don't pay out when a bond's market price goes down. They pay when the bond fails to make its regular interest payments or if it's in danger of not being able to pay back the principal on the bond. Swaps were originally intended to be like an insurance policy on the default risk of bonds. They were originally designed to protect investors from the risk of defaults on mortgage-backed bonds, but they can also be used for other types of bonds as well. How they work is one investor creates the swap and then sells the protection to another investor, just like how an insurance company creates an insurance product and then sells it to the customer. But there's one very big difference. When your insurance company sells you a policy to protect your car against a future accident, they are required by law to set aside some of the money they collect in premium, about 10%, for the day that you actually have an accident and they need to pay out a claim. Since a swap isn't technically insurance, the seller of the swap does not have to set aside a penny to protect them from the eventual default event. On top of that, when bonds go into default, it usually doesn't stop at one. Imagine what would happen to your insurance carrier if 25% of all the drivers that they insure all had an automobile accident on the very same day. In 2008, over 25% of all mortgage-backed security swaps had to pay out all at once. And this nearly destroyed American Insurance Group, or AIG, who was at the time one of the top sellers of mortgage-backed security swaps. To make matters even more confusing, there is no limit on how many times a swap can be created for a single bond or entity. In other words, a seller can sell the same swap to an unlimited number of investors and then collect the premium on all of those investments. If the swap never has to pay out, then the seller makes a killing. If the swap has to pay out, then there's no way that the seller will be able to pay all the claims to the hundreds of policyholders, and so the seller is forced to declare bankruptcy or beg the government for a bailout. I highly recommend that you watch the movie or read the book, The Big Short. In it, you'll find most of what I described above, but in a more entertaining format. The basic premise of the book and the film is how a small group of investors discovered that the housing market was a gigantic bubble that was about to pop. And it was made worse by deregulation of the derivatives market, and how they individually cashed in by shorting the American economy, while the rest of us lost our homes, our jobs, our life savings, while all the bad guys who created this mess simply got away with it. So the Federal Reserve and Congress took a lot of flack for what they did in the last crisis, so they pledged that they wouldn't do another massive bailout of Wall Street ever again. Unfortunately, they also failed to enact any regulations in order to prevent another financial crisis. So, how exactly are they going to do that? What we learned in the Chapter 14 lecture is that what they've done is they've given the banks the authority to pull money out of their depositors' accounts to pay out the swaps to their investors like they did in Cyprus in February of 2013. It's called a bail-in, and you've already told the bank that they can steal your money to pay off their gambling bets. You don't remember doing that? Oh, that's okay. You did that the moment you opened your bank account with them. Futures and forwards. These are bets where you agree to pay an investment or currency at today's rate at some future date. If the price goes up in the future and when the contract is due, then you'll experience a gain. If the price goes down, then you'll experience a loss. Now, I'm not totally against futures because when used properly, they can generate you needed cash flow for industries that have long tail investment needs for products to produce, such as farm products, automobile manufacturing, and forwards are necessary for protecting companies who have a great deal of investments in foreign currencies because it balances out the risk of exchange rate changes. Generally, I'm very supportive of investors who wish to invest their money in things that will generate new ideas, new jobs, or new ways of doing things. However, I believe it is not only counterproductive, but unethical to invest money simply for the sake of making more money without giving any thought to the opportunity cost to the overall economy. For every dollar invested in things like shorts, swaps, or other derivative products, there is one less dollar invested in those things that will make everyone's lives just a little bit better.